Chapter 1. Conch trumpets blared a battle cry. War drums boomed on the opposite banks of a small lake. Stood two generals clad in leather armor and metal helmets. They waved their war fans and shouted the command, "Attack!" Two armies of mounted troops plunged into the lake and charged. Chamberlain Sano Ichido rode at the forefront of his yelling, whooping comrades. Water splashed his armor as his horse galloped towards the onrushing enemy legion. He and his army drew their swords while their mounts swam into the deep middle of the lake. The opposition met them, swords waving, lances aimed. On shore the generals barked the orders to stay in ranks, but in the lake it was utter chaos. Soldiers hacked wildly at one another with their swords and lances. The noise of wooden weapons battering armor and metal deafened Sano. As he fought, he sat in his saddle waist deep in water that was filthy with mud and manure. His army's mounts buffeted his horse, rammed his legs. Sano thanked the guards for iron shin guards. He swatted his opponent, knocking the man off his mount. A rider armed with a lance charged at Sano. He whacked the lance with his sword. Unbalanced, the rider toppled into the lake. Cheers and applause resounded. The audience was crowded in stands alongside the artificial lake, and leaning out of the windows in the covered corridors that topped the walls which enclosed the Edo Castle martial arts practice grounds. Spectators laughed as they egged on their armies, enjoying the tournament. But Sano and everyone else who competed in them knew that these tournaments were almost as dangerous as real battles. Somebody always got hurt, sometimes players were killed. Audiences enjoyed that the best. It was the most exciting part of the game. The lake grew crowded with men who'd fallen in. They frantically swam, trying to avoid being kicked or crushed by the horses. Fighters howled in genuine pain from the blows dealt by the blunt, yet heavy wooden weapons. Sano took a whack on his shoulder and knew he'd have a big bruise tomorrow. As he parried his opponent's strikes, he thought that, perhaps at his age of 43 years, he was too old for tournaments. But it was his duty to participate for as long as he could. "Stop!" cried a shrill, reedy voice. The battle suddenly halted. Men reined in their horses and froze as if turned to stone. Sano sat with his sword crossed against his opponent in the lake. Men treaded water, blades hovered, suspended in the act of striking. "Hold that pose!" the Shogun called from inside a pavilion that stood on the rise near one end of the lake. Thunder grumbled, and a drizzly rain began to fall from the misty grey summer sky, but nobody dared to move. Tokugawa Toyoyoshi, the supreme dictator of Japan, knelt at a table spread with paper, inkstones and jars that held the brushes and waters. He wore a smock over his silk robes and a cylindrical black cap of his rank. He squinted at the battle scene, then sketched rapidly with his brush. An admirer of all forms of art, he dabbled in painting, and equestrian scenes were among his favorite subjects. Sano had seen his work and thought it was not bad, certainly better than his leadership over Japan. "That's enough," the Shogun called. "Continue." The battle resumed with increased gusto. Shoulders swung, blades whacked, more riders fell. Sano fought with less care for martial technique than determination to avoid a lucrative accidental death. He had to admit that tournaments were rather fun, in addition to serving purposes even more important than entertaining his lord. Edo, the capital of the Tokugawa regime, was a city populated by more than 1 million people, some 100,000 of them samurai. That equaled to many armed men with not enough to do during a peacetime that had lasted almost a century with only one minor interruptions. There hadn't been a battle since Lord Matsudaya had defeated his rival Yanagisawa Yoshiyasu 7 years ago. A conflict had flared up between Lord Matsudaya and Sano, but had ended with Lord Matsudaya's ritual suicide last spring. Now the troops were restless. Tournaments not only occupied the samurai class and offered it a chance to improve martial arts skills that had declined, they burned off energy that would otherwise be applied to brawling, starting insurrections, and generally causing trouble. A bell clanged, signaling the battle's end, not a moment too soon for Sano. He and his army rowed, swam, and trudged to one side of the lake, while the enemy forces retreated to the other side. The judge counted the men who hadn't fallen in the water, then announced, "Team number 1 is the winner!" The men on Sano's side cheered, as did the audience. The opposition looked disgruntled. Sano urged his horse up the bank, then jumped out of the saddle. He slipped on the mud and would have fallen, but a strong hand gripped his arm. He turned to see who had caught him. It was a tall samurai in a black armor tunic with red lacings. The samurai took off his helmet. Sano beheld the handsome face of Yanashikawa, his one-time foe. "Many thanks," Sano said. "It was my pleasure," Yanagisawa said. He and Sano had a long, bitter history. Yanagisawa had been chamberlain when Sano had entered the Shogun service 12 years ago. Yanagisawa had once viewed Sano as his rival, had schemed to destroy him. A murder investigation on which they'd been forced to collaborate had resulted in a truce, and later his conflict with Lord Matsudaya had taken Yanagisawa's attention off Sano. Lord Matsudaya had capped his victory by exiling Yanagisawa to Hachiro Island, but Yanagisawa had escaped and sneaked back into Edo, where he had operated behind the scenes, stealing allies from Sano and Lord Matsudaya, pinning them against each other, and engineering Lord Matsudaya's downfall. Last spring, Sano had forced Yanagisawa out of hiding. Yanagisawa had made a triumphant comeback that coincided with Lord Matsudaya's suicide. With Lord Matsudaya dead, the game was once again between Sano and Yanagisawa. They'd done unforgivable things to each other, and Sano had expected Yanagisawa to renew his attacks with a vengeance. Sano had braced himself for the fight of his life. But it hadn't come. Now, Yanagisawa smiled in the same friendly fashion with which he'd treated Sano since a few days after he'd made his reappearance on the political scene. He smoothed his hair, which had grown back since he'd shaved his head to disguise himself as a priest while in hiding. It was too short to tie in a customary samurai top knot, but thick and glossy and black, even though he and Sano were the same age, and Sano's hair had begun turning grey. "You fought a good battle," Yanagisawa said. Sano listened for nuances of hostility in Yanagisawa's tone, but heard none. "So did you." Yanagisawa laughed. "We slaughtered those poor bastards." Not once had he lifted a hand to harm Sano. For over a year he and Sano had coexisted in peace that Sano hadn't thought possible. Not that Sano minded a reprieve from feuding and assassination attempts, but their pleasant camaraderie felt all wrong, like the sun shining at midnight. He and Yanagisawa took their place at the head of their rowdy, cheering army. The judge said to them, "Your team wins the top prize for equestrian combat in water, a barrel of the best sake for each man. I commend your excellent coaching." "Isn't it a good thing we're on the same side now?" Yanagisawa said to Sano. "Indeed," Sano said with faint enthusiasm. Yanagisawa was up to something. Sano knew that. So did everyone else. Sano had overheard their colleagues in the government speculating about what Yanagisawa had in store for him, and taking bets to when Yanagisawa would make his first move. The Shogun came hurriedly up to them. He was a thin, frail, and looked a decade older than his 55 years. A servant held an umbrella over his head, protecting him from the drizzle. "Ah, Sano-san, Yanagisawa-san," he exclaimed. The light animated his weak, aristocratic features. "Congratulations on your, victory." Sano and Yanagisawa bowed and made modest disclaimers. Yanagisawa didn't try to hog the credit or make Sano look bad, as he would have in the past. Sano didn't trust their radical change in behavior. "You make such a good team," the Shogun said. "I think I made the right decision when I appointed both of you as my chamberlains." They shared the post of chamberlain and second in command to the Shogun. That honor, which had first belonged solely to Yanagisawa, had passed to Sano when Yanagisawa had been exiled. When Yanagisawa returned, he had expected to regain the post, and Sano had been ready to fight to keep it. But the Shogun, always loath to exercise his judgment, had been unable to choose which one of them he preferred, and made the unprecedented move of splitting the job between two men whose antagonism could wreak havoc in the government and tear Japan apart. Some said it was the most foolish decision ever made by this dictator, not known for his wisdom. Nobody thought that the partnership between Sano and Yanagisawa would last a day without a blow-up, but had defied the odds. Sano had expected Yanagisawa to oppose everything he did, to undermine his standing with the Shogun, to try to turn every powerful man inside and outside the regime against him and run him out of office. But Yanagisawa had cooperated fully, and to all appearances, gladly with Sano. Together they'd overseen the huge complicated machine of the Bakufu, Japan's military government, with smooth, startling efficiency. Yanagisawa lifted his eyebrow at Sano. Imagine all the good we could have accomplished years ago if we'd been working together. Instead of you trying to kill me and me trying to fend you off, Sano thought. 2 heads are better than 1, he said out loud. Yes, the Shogun agreed happily. Because he hated and feared conflict, he was glad to see his 2 dearest friends getting along so well. He didn't know they'd ever been enemies, or had once vied for control of his regime, which was tantamount to treason. He was astoundingly oblivious to what went around him, and Sano and Yanagisawa enforced a conspiracy of silence to keep the Shogun ignorant. Often, Sano suspected that the Shogun knew the truth perfectly well, but acknowledging it would require him to take action for which he hadn't the stomach. Well, the fun's over, Yanagisawa said. Back to business for us, Honorable Chamberlain Sano. Yes, Honorable Chamberlain Yanagisawa, Sano said. Although his former enemy's words were spoken with no trace of threat, Sano searched them for hidden meanings. He knew the game between him and Yanagisawa was still on, and he was at a serious disadvantage. Sano's spies hadn't managed to dig up a single clue as to what Yanagisawa was plotting. To all appearances, Yanagisawa had decided that it was better to join forces with Sano instead of risking his neck again. Yanagisawa had reportedly told his allies among the top officials in the daimyo, feudal lords who governed Japan's provinces, that he wasn't interested in fighting Sano anymore, and he'd not tried to recruit Sano's allies to his side. Yanagisawa had changed the rules of the game, but Sano didn't know what they were. He felt like a blind samurai heading into battle. He could only wait, a sitting target. The audience departed, the armies dispersed. Waterlogged troops trudged off to drink, celebrate, commiserate, or bath. Grooms took charge of the horses. The Shogun climbed into his palanquin, and his bearers carried him towards the palace. Yanagisawa looked past Sano and said, "I believe there's someone who would like your attention." Sano turned. He saw some 30 paces away an elderly samurai waiting alone beside the stands. Watching him, recognition jolted Sano. Into his heart crept a cold sensation of dread. Chapter 2. Sano stood perfectly still as the samurai walked across the martial arts grounds towards him. Everyone else receded to the edges of his awareness. Sano felt as if he and the samurai were alone in the muddy, trampled field. He suppressed an irrational urge to draw his sword. Its blade was wooden, and this encounter wasn't a duel. Then again, perhaps it was. The samurai stopped a few paces from Sano. He was in his 60s, his physique lean but strong. His shoulder had squarely rigid. He wore a metal helmet and a leather armor tunic with the Tokugawa triple hollyhock leaf, crest embossed on his breastplate over a silk robe and trousers strapped in dark grey-black. An insignia on his helmet showed that he held the rank of major in the army. His forehead was severely creased, as if from too much frowning. Harsh lines bracketed his tight mouth. "Good day," he said, bowing. "Please permit me to introduce myself." His deep voice was a faint quiver of old age, and an oddly familiar ring. "I am Kumasawa Hiroyuki." "I know," Sano said. He'd never met Major Kumasawa before face to face. They'd never spoken, but he'd observed the man from a distance and knew everything about him that the official government records and Sano's own spies could tell. In Sano's desk was a dossier on the entire Kumasawa clan. Sano had compiled it after a murder investigation that had revealed secret facts about his own background. His parents had led him to believe that his mother came from humble peasant stock. Not until last spring, when she had been accused of a crime hidden in the past, had Sano learned the truth. Her kin were high-ranking Tokugawa vassals. They disowned her because of a mistake she'd made when she was a girl, and she'd never seen them again. Now Sano felt a flame of anger heat in his blood. Major Kumasawa was the head of the clan that had treated Sano's mother so cruelly. Sano said, "Do you know who I am?" Major Kumasawa didn't pretend to misunderstand, didn't give the obvious answer that everybody knew, the famous Chamberlain Sano. "Yes, you're the son of my younger sister Itsuko." He spoke as if his words tasted bad. "That makes you my nephew." It was just as Sano had suspected. Although he had long been ignorant of his connection with the Kumasawa, they hadn't been aware that their blood ran in his veins. They must have kept track of his mother and her son through the years. They must have followed his career. The flame of Sano's anger grew. The Kumasawa had spied on him and never deigned to seek his acquaintance. That casting off his mother and refusing to recognize her offspring was what any high society family would have done under the circumstances, did not appease Sano. He was insulted that his uncle should treat him with such disdain. He also experienced other emotions he hadn't expected. Since learning about his new relative, he had intended to get in touch with them, but kept putting it off. He was busy running the government and advising the Shogun. He didn't have time, or so he had told himself. But he'd entered secret fantasies about summoning his uncle to his mansion and impressing him with how well he'd done without any help from their clan. The fantasies shamed Sano. He knew they were childish. Now here he was, face to face with his uncle, soaked with water polluted by horse dung. He felt less like a shogun second in command than an outcast. "I don't suppose you approached me in order to inquire about my mother," he said in his coldest, most formal tone. "No," Major Kumasawa said, equally cold. "But I will ask, how is she?" "Quite well." "No thanks to you," Sano thought. "She was widowed 11 years ago when my father died. My father the Ronin, the lowly masterless samurai that your family forced her to marry to get her off your hands." "But she remarried last fall." "To the man with whom she had an illicit affair, the result of which caused your clan to disown her. She and her new husband are living in Yamato." The murder investigation had reunited Sano's mother with the one-time monk she'd fallen in love with as a girl. Loving him still, she had happily given up her home and her old life in Edo to join him in the village where she'd settled. "So I've heard," said Major Kumasawa. "Of course I'm not responsible for what became of your mother." Sano was glad she had found happiness after the years of disgrace and misery inflicted by a relative, but she had left him with unfinished business. "Not directly responsible, perhaps." Major Kumasawa frowned, deepened the wrinkles in his forehead at Sano's bitter tone. "My father disowned Itsuko. When he died and I became head of the clan, I merely honored his wishes. Were you in my position, you'd have no choice but to do the same." Sano didn't think he'd have been so unyielding for the sake of mere convention. He knew it was unreasonable for him to be disturbed about something that happened so long ago, which his mother had forgiven. Yet he felt a personal injury had been done to him by Major Kumasawa. He had the strange sensation that they'd met before, although he knew they had not. "So you upheld your family's ban on contact with my mother, which extended to me. Why break it now?" Major Kumasawa spoke reluctantly, as if fighting an internal struggle against tradition and duty. Because I need a favor." "Ah," Sano said. "I should have guessed." Since he'd become Chamberlain, thousands of people had lined up outside his door to ask for favors. Sano regarded his uncle with disgust. "Do you think I like crawling to you, the son of my disgraced sister?" Major Kumasawa said, angry himself now. "Do you think I want to ask you for anything?" "Obviously not," Sano retorted, "so I'll spare you the grief." He turned and started to walk away towards the gate in the stone wall that enclosed the martial arts grounds. Beyond the gate lay the Shogun's palace, the official headquarters, and Sano's own spacious compound, the rarefied world in which he'd earned a place. He wasn't even curious about what his uncle wanted. It had to be money, a promotion, or a job for a friend or relative. It always was. "Wait! Don't go," Major Kurosawa called. The anger had disappeared from his voice, which now resonated with such pleading that Sano halted. I can understand why you don't like me or want to help me," Major Kurosawa said. "But the favor I need isn't for my benefit. It's for someone who had nothing to do with what happened to your mother, who's never done wrong to you or anybody else. Someone who's in serious danger." That got Sano's attention. His conscience and his honor wouldn't let him walk away from an innocent person in danger. Facing his uncle, he said, "Who is it?" The sternness of Major Kurosawa's expression had hardened, as though he was trying to keep his emotion at bay. It's my daughter." Sano knew that Major Kurosawa had 3 daughters and 2 sons, Sano's cousins, all of whom Sano had never met. Her name is Chiro," Major Kurosawa said. "She is my youngest child." "What about her?" Sano recalled her name from the dossier. She was 33 years old and wife of a captain in the army of a rich, powerful daimyo. She had married very late, at age 27. Informants had told Sano that she was her father's favorite, and Major Kurosawa had delayed her marriage to keep her at home while he found her the best possible husband. "She's missing," Major Kurosawa said. Sano remembered that terrible winter when his own son had been kidnapped, and his wife Reiko had suffered the pain of not knowing what had happened to their beloved child while fearing the worst. His resistance towards his uncle began to crumble. "I know Chio is none of your concern, but please hear me out," Major Kurosawa said with the gruffness of a man unaccustomed to begging. All right, Sano had to listen. He owed his uncle that, if nothing else. Chio disappeared the day before yesterday. She had gone to the Awashima shrine. Obviously revealed that Sano had given him another chance, yet hating his role as supplicant, Major Kurosawa explained. She gave birth to a child last month, a boy. It was custom for mothers to take their new babies to shrines to be blessed. She went with her attendants. There was a big crowd at the shrine. One moment Chio was there, and the next, Major Kurosawa held up his palms. Gone. Anger showed through his rigid expression. Whenever Sano thought of the night his son, Masahiro, had disappeared during a party at a temple, he shivered. What happened to the baby? He was found laying outside the shrine. Thank the gods he's safe, said Major Kurosawa. Shio's guards couldn't find her. They went home and told her husband what had happened. He told me. We both gathered all the truth we could and sent them out in search for Shio. They're still out looking, but there's been no sign of her. It's as if she's just vanished into the air. Sano knew that his uncle commanded a Tokugawa garrison outside Edo, and Shio's husband must have many men serving under him, but the city was too big for them to cover thoroughly. Did you report her disappearance to the police? Of course, I went to the headquarters. They took my report and said they would keep an eye out for her, Major Kurosawa expelled, his breath in disdainful huff. They said that was all they could do. The police had their hands full keeping order in the city, Sano knew. They couldn't drop everything to search for one woman, even if her father was a Tokugawa army officer, and Major didn't rate high enough. Could Shio have run away on her own? Sano asked. That's impossible. She wouldn't have left her children and husband without so much as an explanation. I suppose you consider the possibility that Shio was kidnapped, Sano said. What else could I think? Worry about his daughter showed through Major Kurosawa's sarcasm. People don't just drop off the face of the earth. Can you think of anyone who would want to hurt Shio? Nobody. She's good, decent, harmless girl. Do you have any enemies? Sano asked. Every man with some standing in the world has enemies, Major Kurosawa said. You of all people should know that. I talked to a few of the men who might have grudges against me, but they insisted that they had nothing to do with her disappearance. I think they're telling the truth. They're treating me as if I'd gone insane, he added morosely. There'd be no ransom letter? No letter, Major Kurosawa said. I'm at my wits. You have a reputation as a great detective. That's why I've come to you, to ask you, find my daughter. Sano couldn't refuse, for reasons almost as important as saving a woman in peril. His son Masahiro wasn't the only member of his family who had been kidnapped. So had his wife, Reiko, 7 years ago. Had Sano not managed to rescue her, he would have lost his wife and Masahiro his mother. Sano couldn't withhold his help from another family facing a similar disastrous situation. You don't owe me anything, Major Kumasawa said. You're bitter about the past, but please, don't hold it against Shio. She wasn't even born when my parents disowned your mother. She had no say in the matter of our clan keeping ourselves apart from you. For her sake, not mine. Please help me. Do you want me to beg? I will. I'll do anything to save my daughter. Major Kumasawa dropped heavily to his knees, as if the tendons behind him had been slashed. Alone on the muddy field, he looked like a general who had lost a battle and must commit suicide rather than live with the disgrace. He took off his helmet, the damp wind-ruffled grey hair that had escaped from his topknot. For once he seemed human, vulnerable. He gazed up at Sano, his eyes fierce with entreaty and humiliation. Sano had once imagined forcing his uncle to kneel to him, subjugating the man who'd maintained his mother's banishment from her family. But now he felt no satisfaction. He had too much sympathy for Major Kumasawa's plight. Very well, Sano said. I'm at your service. He had wanted a chance to know his new clan, and here it was. Perhaps he could even reunite his mother with her family, which he knew she'd always longed for. Major Kumasawa bowed his head. 1,000 thanks. His tone held less relief than resentment, as if done Sano a favor. Although Sano understood that his uncle had lost face, a painful blow to a proud samurai, he was offended at being treated with such a lack of respect or appreciation. Then again, what else could he have expected? Don't thank me yet, Sano said. There was no guarantee that he would find Shiro alive. She'd be gone for 2 days, long enough for the worst to happen. I'm not making any promises. Chapter 3. The corpse of a young samurai lay amid the rises and reeds beside a pond coated with green algae. Blood covered the front of his kimono. A mosquito alighted between his closed eyes. His hand flew up and swatted the mosquito. Don't move! Cried Chamberlain Sano's son, Masahiro, from behind a nearby tree. Almost 10 years old, dressed in kimono surcoat and trousers with 2 swords at his waist, he bore a strong resemblance to his father. He wore his hair in a forelock tied above his brow, the custom for young samurai who hadn't reached manhood. You're supposed to be dead. I'm sorry, young master, but these bugs are eating me up, the samurai said contritely. How much longer do I have to lie here like this? The boy tiptoed slowly across the grass towards the samurai. Until after I discover your body. From inside the mansion, whose wings enclosed the garden, Lady Raiko stepped onto the veranda. She was beautiful in a green silk summer kimono, patterned with dragonflies and water lilies. Lacquer combs anchored her upswept hairdo. What's going on? She called. I'm playing detective, Masahiro answered. Lieutenant Tanuma is the murder victim. Not again, Raiko sighed. She wasn't sure what to make of her son's game. On the one hand, she was proud of his cleverness, his imagination. Most boys his age only played ball or fought mock battles. On the other hand, Raiko was concerned about his preoccupation with violent death. He had seen too much of it in his short life, and had even killed in self-defense. Raiko and Sano blamed their life at the center of the political turmoil and their habit of talking too freely about the murder cases they'd investigated together. They thought Masahiro was too young to understand what they were saying, but they'd been wrong. Masahiro pretended to stumble upon Lieutenant Tanuma. What's this? He exclaimed and laughed. Oh, it's a corpse! Raiko didn't know whether to be glad he had a sense of humor after everything that had happened to him, or worried that his experiences had made him callous, or simply horrified that he'd invented such a ghoulish pastime. What is that red substance on Lieutenant Tanuma's clothes? She asked, hoping it wasn't actually blood. It's ink, Masahiro said. You shouldn't make Lieutenant Tanuma play with you, Raiko said. It's not his job. Tanuma was her chief bodyguard when she went outside the estate. I don't mind, he said. A homely, serious man, he'd replaced Raiko's favorite, Lieutenant Asukai, who died last year in the line of duty. Raiko still missed the handsome, gallant and adventurous Asukai, who had saved her life more than once. But Tanuma did his own solemn best. Anything to attain the young master. Don't spoil him, Raiko protested. Masahiro was rummaging through the reeds. Where's the murder weapon? I put it right down here. Giggles issued from behind a flower bed. Out peeked Masahiro's 2-year-old sister Akiko. She held up a dagger whose blade was stained red. Hey, you stole it, Masahiro said. Give it to me. As he stalked towards Akiko, she ran. Come here, you little thief. He chased her while she waved the dagger and laughed, her pigtails and the skirt of her pink kimono flying. She was happy to have the attention of her big brother she adored, who was always too busy to play with her. Reiko gasped in alarm. That's a real dagger! Masahiro, you know you shouldn't leave weapons lying around where your sister can get them. She could hurt herself. Reiko joined the chase. When she finally caught Akiko, she was breathless and perspiring. Her hair was wind-blown. She took away the dagger and said, The game is over. Lieutenant Tanuma got to his feet, bowed and made a quick exit. Masahiro said, But mother... Don't you have lessons to study? Reiko said. I'm finished. Then practice martial arts. Already did. Can't you play other games that don't involve weapons or murder? Yes, but this is the most exciting. As he traipsed off towards the house with Akiko tagging after him, Masahiro added wistfully, It's been a long time since anything exciting has happened around here. It had been more than a year, Reiko thought, since Lord Matsudaira's death had put an end to the political strife that had threatened their family. Reiko shuddered to think of the dreadful time, when she and her children had lived in a state of siege, prisoners in their own home, under constant guard. Lord Matsudaira's final attack had come from assassins he had planted in the household. Reiko and the children had barely escaped death. She still had nightmares. She didn't miss those days, and she was disconcerted to see that Masahiro did. She had to remind herself that Masahiro was too young to realize how serious the situation had been. Children, especially strong, brave boys like her son, believed they were invincible, and Masahiro thrived under conditions that most people found traumatic. No wonder he thought the current state of peace was boring. Today Reiko realized that she agreed. At first she'd been thankful for the peace and quiet. She'd been glad that Yanagisawa apparently didn't intend to continue his hostilities against Sano. She'd wanted only to raise her family without fear. She was glad not to worry every day about whether Sano would come home alive. For the past year, she'd devoted herself to being a good mother and wife. She'd become very domestic, taking up feminine activities such as flower arranging. Since the political situation had stabilized, and Sano seemed likely to hold his position for a while, people had flocked to curry favor with him. Prominent men had sent their wives to cultivate Reiko, because she had strong influence with the Chamberlain. The wives brought their children to play with hers. Reiko found some of the wives dull and catty, but others intelligent and stimulating. She made new friends and enjoyed the social world, but enough was enough. As Reiko stood alone in the garden, her old adventurous spirit revived. She looked up at the grey clouds, ever present during this extremely wet, rainy season. The leaves of the trees, the shrubs and the grasses were lush and green. She felt the mist in the air, heard birdsong. She appreciated the natural beauty around her. But where was the challenge? She wasn't meant for the circumscribed existence that was normal for women of her class. She missed the days when she had run a service that helped women in trouble, when she had helped Sano solve crimes. Reiko inhaled deeply, as if trying to breathe her native air of excitement and danger. She was eager to take on a new investigation. But how? And when?